I'd like us all to join in and give a warm welcome to Bruce.
In Australia, this great country, we've had a shocking education. When I was a young fellow, we shifted schools a lot because my father was a wandering man, and he went from job to job. He was always employed, he was a clever man, but we just went from school to school to school as kids. And every school we went to, we were taught that Aboriginal people, as soon as they encountered Europeans, they just upped tricks and went into the missions and started drinking tea and eating white flour. And that was about, all we knew about Aboriginal people. And the only physical thing we ever did at school was to colour in a boomerang. And sadly, I have seen Australian school children doing that in the last 5 years as part of Aboriginal studies. We know nothing in this country about our history, and we seem to be resentful of any urging on behalf of Aboriginal people to acknowledge the history. There's never going to be communication between black and white in this country until we appreciate the same history. When Europeans, French, Germans, Italians come over to Australia, they want to know about the Australian story. I've worked in the tourism industry, taking tours around Cape Otway Lighthouse, and it was always the overseas people who wanted to know about Australian history. And when they read on the history boards at the lighthouse, the kindergarten story that passes as Australian history, you could see them starting to laugh, because they knew what dispossession was. The Germans knew what massacre was. And they were just laughing because it was inconceivable that this could be represented as a history of a nation. And this is what we believe in. It infects every conversation we have. And that is why Linda Burney is being sued. Not because she's racially vilifying people, but because she's black and she's a woman with an opinion. And you combine all those things together, woman, opinion and black, and you've got trouble. And we have to support her. This is our country. Its dignity, its fairness is up to us. No one else is going to do it. So we have to find the people who let the dogs out and make sure that those dogs go back in. This here is Mungungurra, possum country in Bidwell lands, Narrabri lands. These are some of the eggs of the rainbow serpent. And there's great song lines all through this country that connect up every clan in this land. The 400 odd language groups and sovereign nations that represent Australia are connected by song lines like this one. And it allowed us as Aboriginal people, I've got Yuin, I've got Bunurong, and I've got Tasmanian and some Ngarrindjeri Aboriginal heritage. And all of those places were contacted by songline. So story, song, dance, trade, morality, law, government was all conducted along those song lines. And those song lines are still there. Most of our highways are song lines. The Princes Highway is actually part of the Rainbow Serpent travel, part of this fella here. And it binds the country together. And it's something we could learn together. And next year, for NAIDOC Week, last year was songlines, this year it's going to be language. And you mesh the two of those together and you've got a very powerful historical tool. And we're looking forward to celebrating Aboriginal life on this country next year. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the things that shocked me when my elders started to educate me properly, because I was a university student when I first started looking for family. You know, the history of my family is about as ridiculous as the history of Australia that has been perpetrated, because there were so many holes in my family story that you just couldn't, you know, you could see that something was wrong. And I started trying to, you know, put the pieces back together. And my elders said, well, we're not going to tell you anything about your family until you know something about Australian history, because the two go together. And if you remain ignorant about the history of the country, you remain ignorant about your family. So until you learn the history, we're not going to tell you about family. So over about 4 or 5 years, they gave me a crash course in Australian history. And it was, for me, it was unbelievable. You know, I'd swallowed the thimble and pea. I was a university student. I considered myself reasonably intelligent, and yet I believed this ridiculous story of Australia's last 220 years. And one of the things that convinced me that something was very wrong was after a book called Convincing Ground that I wrote about the contact wars in Australia, I was getting a lot of letters and emails from Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people about things that had been going on in the country that they had witnessed, that they thought I would be interested in. And I'm forever grateful for those readers who sent me this stuff. And one of the people sent me this map. Now, it was made by the Rural something or other and research organisation, and they put together a map from the writings of Norman Tyndale, who was very interested in Aboriginal people. And when you look through the scholarship of Australia and you see someone who's interested in Aboriginal people, you can almost guarantee they're not Australian. You know, Lorandos was Italian, Tyndale was an American, Singh was a Sri Lankan. It just goes on and on and on and on. The bloke who helped the ladies at Mungo, Lake Mungo, to find the grain to make the bread for the, you know, to make panicum decompositum bread, he's a Japanese. What are we doing in this country? Allowing people from elsewhere to teach us about our history. What is it about us that is allowing this to happen? Why do we want strangers to teach us our history? This map represents the Aboriginal grain fields of Australia that Tyndale was able to identify out of the history books of Australia. And you can see that it's 5, 6, 7 times as great as the current Australian wheat belt, which is the dotted line in the southwest and the dotted line in the southeast. So Aboriginal people were harvesting grain over that massive area, including what is now the Australian wheat belt. And we've actually found that it's bigger than that. And the number of grains that were being used were roughly 180, and we're concentrating on 3 of them at the moment: Panicum decompositum, kangaroo grass, and Australian rice. Most people don't even know that there's an Australian rice, but we now think, because of the scholarship of a couple of young Aboriginal women from the Northern Territory, it is thought now that the Australian rice is the parent rice for the rest of the world. The beauty of our Australian rice is it grows almost in completely dry ground with one flooding. This is a boon for Australia, that we can grow rice under these conditions. And environmentally, it's a fantastic thing. So this map really surprised me, because I had no idea that my people were that clever. And I was ashamed to realise that what I'd been taught about my people was absolute rubbish and that I had believed it. I'll go to the next slide, Bryce. And this is up at Lake Mungo. We're grinding the grain into flour, and we cooked that flour at Lake Mungo 18 months ago, and the smell coming from the cooking of that bread was incredible. Now, Panicum decompositum has an aroma, and the whole sand dune, you could smell that bread cooking, and it was so beautiful. But the taste of the bread, you know, we're still learning a lot about it. We had it was about a 45%, 55% blend of normal white wheat flour and Panicum decompositum flour. And that's because we don't understand yet enough of how those old girls cooked the bread. Were they using a rising agent? How did they process it? Did they allow a ferment to exist? How was it done? We've got 500 cooking shows in Australia at the moment. Not one of them can answer that question, and that's a disgrace. So I was very close at Lake Mungo to an area where Charles Sturt was dying, not concurrently with my visit, but although it wasn't that much ago. But Sturt was looking for the inland sea, and you got a critic in the audience already. Sturt was looking for the inland sea, which he never found because it wasn't there. But he took a whaleboat with him anyway, just to be sure. But Sturt was a good writer, and one of the better explorers in terms of his attitude to Aboriginal people. We give him a lot of credit because of that attitude to Aboriginal people that he tried to conciliate. As far as I know, he never killed anyone. So that makes him the only other Australian explorer who never murdered Aboriginal people. Because even Sir Thomas Mitchell, the great Sir Thomas Mitchell, murdered plenty. But Sturt had this attitude that, you know, people were people, you know, live and let live, that sort of thing. He was a humanitarian, but his brother was riding 2 days behind him, pegging out the land. Even though this man is a gentle human being, giving credit to Aboriginal people, acknowledging their history, his brother is pegging out land that he knew that his brother, Charles, knew was Aboriginal land. So even the best European at that time was set on taking the land. Even James Dawson, the great historian and farmer around Camperdown in Victoria, even he, the man who fought tooth and nail with the local white population to erect a memorial to the Aboriginal people of that area, he was still taking up the land of his friends. He considered the Aboriginal people to be his friends, but he was still taking up their land. It was a very confused period in Australian history. But old Charles is almost dead. All the horses are so weak. Many of them have already been killed for food. And they've been climbing sand dunes for a fortnight, one after another, near Coopers Creek, between Coopers Creek and the Warburton River. And they get to the top of one last sand dune, they're staggering down the other side, and Sturt says that the horses were so weak they could only stumble in a straight line down the face of that dune. And when they reached the bottom, they were hailed by 400 Aboriginal people who raced to get coulamons of water to revive the explorers, but then they also reached around and gave the water to the horses, an animal they'd never seen. And Sturt remarks on their courage in doing that and also their grace. But then he also talks about how well they were living in the middle of Australia, the place we call the dead heart of Australia. It's now called Sturt's Stony Desert. And in that area, those people were harvesting a grain, and we've got the 500 cooking shows, but no one can tell me what that grain is. I think I know what it is. I think it's this one. But we don't know for sure. But despite 220 years of Australian scholarship, despite 500 cooking shows on radio and television, no one can tell you what grain saves Charles Sturt's life. And he says the cakes that were made from that, he calls them cakes, the cakes that were made from that grain were the lightest and sweetest he'd ever tasted. Now, he was an Englishman, and we know they can't cook. So he might be inclined to exaggerate. But the lightest and sweetest cakes he'd ever eaten, and with all our fascination with culinary delight in this country, we never cooked that bread until this day. And it was those old girls from Lake Mungo, those old girls who took all those archaeologists to task for shifting Lady Mungo. And they, you know, that famous Australian archaeologist, I can't remember his name offhand now, I think I've deliberately forgotten it, but he was the man who dug up Lady Mungo, stuck her in a suitcase and took her back to Melbourne. And in the program that was made about Lady Mungo just recently by those old ladies, he was asked why he hadn't consulted Aboriginal people about the removal of this lady's skeleton. And he said, it's Mulvaney. Mulvaney is the archaeologist. Mulvaney said, oh, well, there were no Aboriginal people around. And then the film cuts to one of those old ladies, and she said, oh, he was right. We were 15 kilometres away. You know, that gentle Aboriginal spirit. No vindictiveness, no hatred, just wry humour. That's black humour. No, we were 15 kilometres away. That's why he couldn't contact them. He couldn't contact them because he didn't want to. Mulvaney, the most famous archaeologist in Australia. So those old girls had already made that film, and then we started having this conversation about what had been grown in the area, and they said, well, we'll find out the answer to that question. And that's what led to this day. We'll have another slide now. And this funny little Japanese guy, for the failure of an Australian academic to take it on, we got a Japanese bike rider to go out there and help those old ladies harvest the grain and turn it into bread. And he got all the Aboriginal kids to make these solar-powered ovens. You know, cornflake boxes in silver foil, and there's the bread in the centre of it. This is on the sand dunes of Lake Mungo. It was a famous day, a great day in Australia's history. And while that was cooking, you know, totally solar-powered, you could smell it. And all the old girls are crying. I'm bloody crying, but I barracked for Richmond, I'm used to it. And, you know, it was just a fabulous day. I'm serious. It was one of the great days in Australian history, and we have to remember it because we haven't had very many great days in Australian history. We'll go to the next one too, boss. There's the bread. Look at that, make you cry. That's 45% panicum decompositum, 55% white bread, and it rose just absolutely fantastic. And, you know, within within 5 years, we'll be eating this out of bakeries, that bread. The Brasserie Bakery in Sydney tasted some of the bread that we baked. Ben Shuri from Attica Restaurant in Melbourne, we cooked him a loaf of bread down at Gypsy Point. He ate 3/4 of the loaf of bread. You know, ease up, mate. There's other people at the table, but no. He ate 3/4 of the loaf of bread. Of course, we were internally we're cheering every time he took a mouthful, and he said, "That's the best bread I've ever had." That's the kangaroo grass bread, that one. But so even though kangaroo grass is very hard to separate the seed from the head, it makes beautiful bread, tiny little seed, and it means that you've got to harvest a lot of it to get enough to make the flour. But one of the points that I hope you'll be interested in is that it's a perennial grass. You never have to plough the land. You never have to seed the land. It seeds itself. And so you can graze that land with cattle or sheep or whatever, preferably kangaroos. Now there's an innovation waiting to happen. You know, we've been grazing kangaroos on our farmland for 220 years and we don't take advantage of it. It's a soft-footed animal. They can be drafted. People say, you can't draft a kangaroo because it jumps. Well, we can send a spaceship to Saturn, but we can't we can't corral a kangaroo because it jumps. Whew. You can see how hard science is. But Aboriginal people drafted kangaroos. Aboriginal people built long wings with brush and logs and connected them up to stony outcrops. And then they'd have more brush wings. And these were sometimes 30 kilometres wide, and they narrowed down to a gate as wide as the aisle here. And that gate led into a compound in which the kangaroos were trapped. But at the other side of the compound, there were 2 gates. It's a typical old drafting yard, really. And they would release some, and those animals could go away. They were all the does, all the joeys, and young male kangaroos would be let go into another compound from which they never emerged. And so these soft-footed animals that helped preserve the Australian soils were harvested by Aboriginal people, apart from the old spear and that. But why is it that all we know about Aboriginal utilisation of kangaroos is the spear? Because we're supposed to be hunters and gatherers. And hunters and gatherers is a very convenient term to use if you want to take someone's land, because that proves that they are not using it. And that's the whole box and dice. The whole system of colonialisation is directed in that way. How can we, as Christians, who believe in thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, how can we as Christians take this land? We'll prove that the people who live here are subhumans who don't know how to use the land. Charles Sturt was fed roast duck and cake by those subhumans who had the grace to give water to horses. Lieutenant Grey came across yam fields that were so deeply tilled that he couldn't walk across them. Now, you might think, you know, I use that example in Dark Emmy, you might think that's the only example. People everywhere in the Pilliga Forest, all through Queensland, came across fields that had been so deeply tilled they couldn't walk across them, they couldn't afford to take their horse across them because the ground had been turned so much that they couldn't risk their horses' legs. This was common. And this is an enormous dedication of labour and enormous investment in Aboriginal agricultural production. And we'll be eating this bread, as I said, and if we convert, say, 5% of our grain lands in the next 10 years, 5% of our grain lands to some of these grains. Now, I passed this morning when Eloise was telling me how bad Richmond was. We passed a kumbungi, a vast kumbungi swamp. And we've been extracting flour out of kumbungi, and it makes a beautiful bread. The bottom part of the root is a beautiful vegetable. It'll be the freshest vegetable you've ever tasted. If you slice the bottom, say 4 inches of kumbungi, and stick it in the salad, you'll be surprised. It's very crunchy. It's got the most refreshing flavour. But as well as that, you can extract starch from the stem and make a delightful bread. So if instead of draining swamps, we allow kumbungi to grow in those swamps, there's another resource for us. And you don't need to plough the land with those other grains. They're perennial. You don't need to plough the land. So if you dedicate 5% of your agricultural production for flour to these grains, you're driving your tractor less, so you're not using as much diesel, you're not compacting the soil as much, and you're not turning over the soil. All of these things are helping us reduce our greenhouse gases. This is an incredible investment in our country's future, simply by using those grains. Take kangaroo grass, for instance. You know, it grows about that, its seed head is about that high. But it's only a sort of a floret of leaves, and then you've got the stem with the grain on the top. But below the soil, there's 8 or 9 times the mass of root below the soil. It's extracting moisture and minerals and fertility from deep down in the soil, and all of those roots are connecting up with all the other roots and holding the soil together. This soil that when I was a kid in the 1960s, 50s, was blowing from Victoria's Mallee across the place where I was living in Fawkner out to sea, because we didn't know how to look after our land, our soil. And farmers must revere the soil. Farmers have to take the soil seriously, because that's where we grow stuff. And if we want to grow more stuff, we've got to make sure that soil is looked after. So if we convert to some of these other plants, we've got an incredible investment in CO2 reduction. And I'm hoping that this message will get out. Not only are we going to be eating gluten-free flours that have this incredible aroma, but we're also going to be helping our CO2 reduction. We've got a rebel in the crowd who wants to ask a question. You always like this?
How about the harvesting of them? Is it usually do this very small scale, like non-machinery?
Look, we've harvested kangaroo grass using a little harvester called a bandicoot, which is drawn. You can use a four-wheel drive vehicle. It's very light, and it comes along beside your vehicle. So you're not dragging it; it's coming along beside you. So for monitoring and all that sort of thing. We've used that, and we've harvested kangaroo grass seed and some other seeds, but only for the purpose of resowing degraded paddocks and things like that. But this summer, we're using that bandicoot to harvest grain at Mallacoota Airport and up at Cooma, over in the Western District near Geelong at Lara, various other places around Victoria and New South Wales. And we're then going to convert that grain into flour, and Attica Restaurant and Brasserie Bakery will buy everything that we can produce at whatever price we set it. That's how much interest there is in these foods. So I'm confident that we're going to get to that 5% in the 10 years. And we'll be looking after our soil, and we'll be not using as much water, we'll be producing a wonderful food for our country, and reducing our CO2 emissions at the same time. It's very hard to see what's against it. And if we then start reintroducing water into the marshlands and growing kumbungi instead of African lovegrass, then we've got another benefit as well. And the marshland, of course, is a natural habitat for animals and birds. Also a way of cleansing water, our water sources. So, we do send, space probes to Jupiter or wherever we go, because we're looking for somewhere else to go, aren't we? We're going to destroy this world. We've got to find another planet quick. Well, I'm going to wave goodbye to that last spaceship because I'm staying here. I love this joint. And we can look after it. We can make sure that this place is looked after, because everything comes from the mother. If we start thinking about the earth not as a resource but our mother, and everything we do to the mother, we do to our own mother, it changes your attitude. When you think, how can I get a BMW? How can I get a big house at Potts Point? How can I go for holidays to Italy all the time? I know. I'll frack the earth. It sounds disgusting, isn't it, to frack the earth, but and it's true, because you punch chemicals into the ground to crack the stone to release the shale oil and the gas and whatever it is, and of course you know exactly where those chemicals are going to go, don't you? You can't extract them again. They're there, and you know they're not going to get into the water table. And that's where your BMW comes from. That's where your Potts Point mansion comes from. What absolute rubbish. If that was your mother, you would not frack your mother. Don't quote me on that. It sounds like Shakespeare, eh? But anyway, we better have another slide. Now we're talking about yam, because Sir Thomas Mitchell, when he was on Garryword, the Grampians in Victoria, he looked west, and as far as the eye could see, he saw yellow flowers on the volcanic soils of the Western District. He didn't see many trees. On Australia's best soil, he saw very few trees. And those of you who have read Bill Gamage's great book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, will know why. Because Aboriginal people had removed the trees so they could grow yam. Now, this painting was sent to Bill Gamage by an art collector in Sydney, and it's Eugene von Gerard's Kangaton, which was painted in 1841, and in the background there, that yellow flower, this is supposed to represent the first introduction of cattle into that area. It's Myrnon. That yellow flower is Myrnon. We'll have the next slide. No, this is a dramatic pause, brother. Yeah. That little stone is that big. This stone was found by Jonathan Jones, Wiradjuri man, and he read Dark Emu, that seminal book, as Patrick mentioned. But Jonathan, then went into the museum in Sydney and asked to see their stone artefacts. That was one of the stone artefacts. It's this big, it's too heavy to work above your head, obviously. You couldn't even do it with one hand. You'd have to hold it two-handed. But it's not to be used above the waist. It's to be used below the waist like this. You can see the binding mark on it. The handle for that tool was vertical at right angles to the stone. It was bound tightly with kangaroo skin, so tightly that even though the recess for the binding had been etched in stone, the compression of the kangaroo tendon is so strong that it left a mark on the stone. And that was a pick. There's 1,000 of these things in the museum. 2 of them have got a label on them that says Bogan pick. They came from the Bogan River. But they're found all around Australia. I found them at Dalesford. I found another couple last week down near Warrnambool. These are picks. They've been used by Aboriginal people to turn the soil. That is the most amazing photograph in Australia's history, because it debunks every idea that Aboriginal people could do nothing. We better have another slide, eh? But I love that photograph. I love Jonathan Jones. What a man. There we have the Murnong. On the right, you've got grandmother, the withered tuber. She was the one who produced the other 2. You can eat the top of Murnong as well as a vegetable, but these are the roots. In the middle, you've got mother, and on the left, you've got child. There's a story, a rich cultural story about that plant, but that's, you harvest the one on the left, obviously, and mother continues on to become grandmother, and child eventually becomes mother. You know, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's a story you can see in the sky. Bushrat ate the middle one, took a piece out of the mother, and to do that bushrat had to walk past strawberries. It's walked past strawberries to dig down and eat that plant. That's how good it is. You can always trust the bushrat. We'll have another one. This is my son's Murnong garden at Apollo Bay. The school allows people to use part of the land for growing anything. You can see the pumpkins on the right, but that's the biggest, when it was made 3 years ago, that was the biggest plantation of yam in Australia. And, you know, it was very important. That one, we think, is Microceras scapigiera. It was sold to us as lanceolata, but its habit is more like scapigiera. And we'll go to the next one now. So lanceolata is one of these plants that was very important for Aboriginal people, and explorers saw it all over the place. E.M. Kerr, when he was going up towards Albury, his cartwheels were going through this soft soil, and they were turning up what he said were bushels of Murnong. With every turn, they were turning up bushels of these plants, because this was Aboriginal land. This was an Aboriginal crop. And how come that soil was so soft then that his cartwheels were sinking to the hub, and now you could drive a double B truck across it without making an impression? How come the soil changed that dramatically? Because there is some symbiosis between lanceolata, the moss, the bulbine lily and the orchids that were grown there. There was some symbiosis that Aboriginal people were utilising to make that tilth of the soil. This is Brewarrina fish traps. Now, this is potentially, so the scientists tell us, the oldest human construction on Earth. The oldest human construction on Earth. It has got one book written about it by all the Australian academics to this date. There is no tourism there except what the local Aboriginal people run. If it was Texas, who voted for Donald Trump incidentally, if it was Texas, there'd be 30 Greyhound buses going there every day and 3 aeroplanes full of tourists wanting to take a photograph of it. No Australian goes there. I did meet a woman last night who'd been there. Bless her, cotton socks, eh? But yeah, you know, but really, Australia should revere this joint. Unfortunately, we've abused it terribly. We dammed the river. The fish that lad has there, it no longer exists because its breeding ground was way upstream. As soon as it was dammed, that finished that fish in 12 months. We'll go for another slide. This is housing, Aboriginal housing. This is up near Lockhart River. We've got family up there. The Memot wrote a great book about Aboriginal housing. It's well worth your while reading that book. It's quite expensive, but it's got these fabulous things in it. We'll have another look at the other slide. Most Aboriginal houses were domed. Next slide. With thatching on them. One of the other indications of civilisation around the world is how the dead are treated. This is done by, I think, is this Mitchell or Sturt? One of Blandowski of an Aboriginal grave. We'll go to the next slide. This is an Aboriginal house that was uncovered at Tirundurra, 2009 in the fires, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. This is not an isolated case. I had a lady called Margie Cooper with me. I met Carol Cooper last night. One of her relations, Margie Cooper, was with me that day, and she sat in that house and bawled her eyes out, because that's where her grandmother was born. We'll go to the next slide. This is Sturt's journal, the great Sturt, and he's drawn an Aboriginal graveyard where every tree had been decorated with art. So there's the old art connection again. The grave is absolutely serene. The paths around it have been manicured. This is absolute reverence for the dead. This was done by the subhuman Aboriginal people that our legislature continues to abuse. We have to get rid of that in our schools. We have to get rid of it in our own minds. It is not true. We have to look after our own people. More examples of housing, and we'll go to the next one as well. This was apparently a common house around Sydney, although there were so many sandstone caves around Sydney that it wasn't always necessary to make those. But you can see how big they are relative to the people. These are massive structures. They're all coated in thatch. And, you know, they've got interior beams and posts and, you know, they're real buildings. We'll go to the next slide. Look at that. $35. Christmas coming up, and I've got about 8 or 9 of them, and I'm not taking them home. I think I'm done. Are we going to do questions and stuff? Yeah, there's Laura. Yeah. Thank you.